Happy Halloween, you guys. Today, we're going to be giving you guys a little bit something special for the Halloween special. I'm going to give you guys my top rankings for worst cantos to best cantos. And I will be telling you guys also what I thought about each canto and their bosses. And the ranking of how it's going to go, it's going to be going from easiest canto boss to hardest canto boss. Because I personally find that the hardest canto bosses was probably the most memorable and also the most enjoyable. So let me know in the comment section down below what you thought was the hardest Canto boss and which one you enjoyed the most. Without wandering too long, we'll jump right into it. So easiest Canto boss by far is the Unloving. Unloving was essentially Rhodion's like little chapter. This was her story. But with her story, with the final boss fight was a very simple 3-4 wave like monster fight fest. That was it. It wasn't that hard, okay? So most underwhelming, but I will say honorable mention, chapter 218 pre-nerf, oh my god, rough. This was probably the first stumbling block that most people had. This was before rework sanity, because when you had 45 sanity, now it means you have a 95% to flip heads if you have 95% sanity, or 45 sanity. But back then, 45 sanity did not mean you had 95%. Your sanity at 45 was not enough to take on freaking Ida. She was hard, so they nerfed her. I will say probably one of the hardest fights in the beginning, before pre-nerf, because it was so freaking hard to pass. Most stumbling block for most people, but I would say Canto 2, weakest boss fights, and also not the easiest. Also, major spoilers ahead if you haven't noticed. Okay, so the next Canto that I thought was the next hardest, so if Canto 2 was the easiest, which one's the next hardest one technically? The Outcast. So the Outcast, very simply put, we had the Golden Apple. So obviously in chapter 1, our first boss encounter was the Golden Apple and the False Apple. This one was honestly our first little boss. It's probably the easiest bosses of them all, because fighting this one wasn't too difficult. I will say that I definitely ran into some issues this one. I think I had to reset once for this boss fight because I didn't know what I was doing. But after I reset it once, like, I just got way better. So second easiest boss fight is Canto 1. Now we're gonna get into the juicy stuff. There's Canto 3, but that's not the next hardest one. So the next hardest one for me personally was Evil Defining. Queen Ahab. So let me explain. So this one is gonna be a little bit controversial, but Queen Ahab was probably the next easiest boss fight for me. The reason why she was the next easiest one was because when I came back, I had essentially pulled for 2 new characters. So I had Yi Sang and Penitence on my team, and Heathcliff on my team, and I also had Rodion already on my team, amongst a few other characters. I think my team, when I came back to the game, was looking something like this. Yeah, once I came back to the game, this was my strongest team once I came back to the game. And this was enough, okay? Queen Ahab was actually not that hard for me because the boss fight was pretty linear. It was a single party boss fight. But I will say the fight that I definitely had the hardest was Queen Quag with this one, not this one. Shoot, where's the fight? Does it say? No. Basically, the hardest fight of this entire story was when you had Starbucks, Queen Ahab, and Queen Quag in like the dungeon where you did like the 3-part battle. That was probably like the hardest battle in that Canto because it was like a 3-way battle, but the final boss was pretty easy. So unfortunately, Queen Ahab for her final boss fight kinda mid, not gonna lie. Now the next hardest one, I would say, would be, which one's the next hardest? You guys are gonna think it's weird. Don Quixote. Let me explain. So, throughout the dungeon here, you would probably say that the Don Quixote fight was probably the hardest because we encounter, well, Don Quixote. If you guys don't remember, this is Don Quixote. The person here, she is Sancho. Long story short, she got her memories wiped. She's a vampire. Took on the memories of her boss, Don Quixote. Now, the reason why this fight was easy is not because my characters are overpowered. It was because when I was streaming, chat told me to just use Don Quixote solo, and I used Sank Don Quixote to solo the fight, and honestly, soloing the fight was way easier. So unfortunately, because chat told me to solo fight Don Quixote with Sancho, I kind of got through with it with relative ease. Don't get me wrong, it took me like probably 4 or 5 resets to figure out how to get lucky. But once I got lucky enough, the rest of the fight was honestly pretty easy. I will say though, this one is more memorable story-wise because it was the first time where we have a little QTE. So memorable, but definitely not the hardest. Now, the next one that would be the hardest, in my opinion, would be Then Changing, Canto 4. Ooh. Canto 4. Now, this one was hard. The reason why Canto 4 was hard was because of, well, this good old fight, okay? Canto 4 was really difficult for me because you couldn't just straight win rate, and the boss would forever, whatever the reason, like stun lock your characters and lock them out. This fight was hard because it drained sanity immensely, and it made it so difficult to just unga bunga turn off my brain win rate, okay? This was one of the bosses where you had to deal with the ego seed, effervescence, you had to deal with a Cal. This was the hard fight. There was also the sun shower boss, if I could find it. I don't think I see it, but it's the sun shower wolf. And the 4 sun shower wolf. Like this. The sun shower wolf was hard to deal with because there would be times when it would trigger sanity loss automatically, which basically made it really hard to like fight because you'd be on low sanity quite a bit. So that's the next hardest one on the list. Now, we're entering into the final few, and there are 2 chapters that we have left. We have Heartbreak, which is Heathcliff's story, but we also have the Unconfronting. So, who takes the top spot? It is not Heathcliff. Hear me out. Heathcliff, my goodness, was something else. He's Canto 5. Oh no, he's not Canto 5, he's Canto 6, right? Canto 6. Heathcliff. Now, oh my goodness, Wild Heathcliff. This was a tough fight for a few reasons, but one of the more memorable ones, let me explain. Okay, Wild Heathcliff was hard because it was so long, but not only that though, the boss fight trailed on. And here's the thing, what made it kind of hard. The reason why I made it kind of hard was, technically speaking, I had Wild Heathcliff on my team when I was playing him, but I didn't realize until the end of the dungeon that Wild Heathcliff could ride a horse. Chat, I did not read what Wild Heathcliff's friggin' passive was, okay? I'm gonna be honest. I came back to the game, went on Pridewin, and apparently they told me that Wild Heathcliff is a really strong unit. I didn't realize how strong he was. I just got it, and I played with him in his base form. So I was playing with these 3 skills for the longest time, but for whatever the reason, I always saw this skill was here, but I didn't know how to gain access to it. So I just never thought about it too much. I was gonna make a sinking team, why not? It wasn't until near the, literally the final boss when I was fighting, Wild Heathcliff himself, did I realize his defense skill puts him on Dullahan. I I was like, what the frick? Anyways, this boss fight was hard because it was so long, it was so tedious, and it was also one of the more memorable ones. I mean, technically speaking, I will say that Heathcliff and Yi Sang's storyline, they're like pretty close. I could have flip-flopped between these two, but since I came back to the game recently, this was more fresh in my memory. This dungeon, I would say, was definitely one of the harder ones because, number one, the fights were so long. The final battle weighed heavily upon me because I definitely had to do a lot of resets for sure. Also, Heathcliff, secretly a 4-star unit. Okay, last but not least, and the one you've been waiting, the hardest boss. You guessed it. For me personally, my hardest situation was, chapter 3. Boards, can I explain to me, you guys, how insane the Cromer fight was? Let me explain. This fight took so many hours. So many hours. On my channel, there's a video of my friend fighting this before pre-nerf. This was the hardest fight ever. Let me explain. Super memorable, super hard. So Cromer fight, if you didn't know, when we fought it, it was pre-nerf. Pre-nerf. Let me explain. When you were playing this game, there were very few IDs that were really good to fight with Cromer. The best team, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, back in the day, I will try to pull it up right now. I'll make a random team up. The best team back in the day when Cromer first came out, like just in general, like the strongest team that you could have based off of the units that were available. I'm pulling them all out right now. I'm pulling out all the strongest units. Hold up, 1 second. Okay. Alright, so back in the day when Cromer first technically released, this was probably your staple strongest team. Okay, this was your strongest team. Now, if you guys did not know, Cromer has a little passive where if she's inflicted with bleed or burn, she heals a crap ton of HP. So what does that mean? That means you could not use Ryoshu, her main ID. You could not use freaking Faust. You couldn't use Sinclair. You couldn't use Mersault. You couldn't use either of freaking Honglu's goddamn identities, because he had like these two, which were bleed, so you couldn't use Honglu. So you couldn't even use freaking her, because her skill bleeds, right? Yeah, she bleeds, so you couldn't use Rodion. So what you were left with was just essentially a mismatch of a combination of these characters, okay? Obviously, you could put like El Corp and all these other characters, but you were essentially very limited on what you could use to fight Cromer because she would heal a ton of HP if she had burn or bleed on her. By the way, I have a video on this of my friend beating her. Back in the day, this was pre-nerf Cromer. A pre-nerf Cromer. And I can tell you, oh my god, it was so hard. I remember vividly, so vividly, that the team that I used to beat Cromer was, I want to say Gregor. I definitely used Base Sinclair. I 100% used Base Sinclair for the Cromer fight. But the Cromer fight by far was the best dungeon in my opinion, because number one, there was a lot of branching paths that you could take, so that you could go out and get different, different items. Like there were items that gave you heal, a revive if a character died, and we needed it. We needed every buff. I remember we needed to find like 3 special little tablets for Sinclair to buff him up. It was so insane. And also the Millie music in this boss fight was so good. So good. Don't get me wrong, Millie does good music, but oh my god, Chroma Chapter 3 was the most insane. But in order, if you guys didn't know, from easiest to hardest, going from easy to hard, Canto's 2, 1, then a Hob, then 7, then 4, then 6, then 3. Jesus Christ, couldn't get my list in order. But those were just my list. Guys, let me know what you think was the hardest Canto fight by far. For me, personally, Canto 3. And I want to say probably Canto 7 might have been hard, but like I said, chat taught me how to cheese it. And unfortunately, it was not as difficult as it could have been. From the looks of it, that fight looked pretty devastating. Anyways, John Panio, signing off. Just want to say happy Halloween. Guys, make sure you join my Discord. I'll put a link down in the description down below. The Discord, we talk about all things Limbus related. Anyways, happy Halloween. See you guys later. Let me know in the comment section what you guys thought was the hardest boss. And I'll see you guys until the next video. John Panio signing off. Bye-bye for now.